Now, you cast your mind back to December. You'll remember I talked, a longer talk then, about all the way up to Apollo 8. So starting at the Second World War, and then talking through the Cold War and the Mercury and Gemini missions, and the beginning of Apollo up to Apollo 8. And then 4 weeks ago, I spoke to you about the two sort of testing missions, Apollos 9 and 10, one in low Earth orbit, and Apollo 10, which actually went almost all the way to the moon. In fact, all except the last 8.5 miles to the moon. They nearly lost it, but actually they learned a great deal from Apollo 10. So what I'm going to talk about now is Apollo 11, the mission that actually achieved President Kennedy's goal in 1969. First of all, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the role of computers in Apollo, because this is all quite interesting to me. If we sort of look here, this is a picture of that I took a few years ago. They've reconstructed in Houston mission control to its 1969 specification. And that's a panoramic stitch up. It's not really bent like that. That's just the way panoramic pictures work of that area. And it was explained at some length that the computing power involved there, this was an IBM mainframe, this was it. That's an original picture from 1969 of the mainframe computer that was actually running all this. And that drives all of these screens here. And they're all monochrome, they're doing quite simple stuff, but it's basically just maths-based stuff. And this computer here had a megabyte of RAM.
This is huge for 1960.
Oh, indeed, that was indeed. And a 4 megabyte hard drive that was delivered by a forklift. And some offline tape storage, which you can see here as well. So here's the thing. My picture here of mission control would not fit in that computer system, all of it. It just simply wouldn't. It's bigger. That's about 10 megs of picture there. And yet, it was up to the task because compared to, say, my much more powerful little laptop here, this is just doing, it's running very optimized machine code computing designed to do a small number of things fast and well, whereas mine is running Windows 10, which does everything slowly. So there we are. That's the main computer system. They had a computer in the spacecraft as well, and this is it. This was the thing they had there. This is that had a magnetic core RAM. Now this is what a magnetic core RAM looks like, and every little black area you can see there is a tiny little ferrite bead that flips polarity depending on whether it's storing a 1 or a 0, and that's 4 kilobytes in that. It also had another 72 kilobytes of ROM. The DSKY, display and keyboard, that's the bit that actually appeared on the Apollo spacecraft panel there. And this thing ran at a clock speed of 2 megahertz, which again was pretty zippy for 1969 standards. My little netbook here runs at 2 gigahertz, 1,000 times faster, although you wouldn't believe it to compare the two in their actions. So, and it works really well. And of course, computers need programs, and they put a woman in charge of that. Her name is Margaret Hamilton, and here she is. And here is a printout of all her computer code that she wrote to run Project Apollo, both in mission control and on the spacecraft. So that's quite extraordinary. When you look at how far we've come with computers in that time, it is quite fantastic. So I'll talk about the mission, Apollo 11. So a very experienced crew. They'd all been on Gemini before. Neil Armstrong, commander. Michael Collins, command module pilot. So he was the guy who didn't go down to the moon. And Buzz Aldrin was the lunar module pilot. So Armstrong and Aldrin went down to the lunar surface. The launch was 16th of July, 1969. From the Kennedy Space Center, Launch Complex 39A. Apollo 10 was unique in that it had used Launch Complex 39B, and actually that was so that they could prepare 39A for Apollo 11 earlier. They were getting to the stage of things where time was fairly crucial in terms of President Kennedy's challenge to do it by the end of the 1960s. They were into the last 6 months at this point. And it landed on the 24th of July, 8 days later, in the North Pacific Ocean. And the achievement, of course, Neil Armstrong became the first man to walk on the moon, followed 19 minutes later by Buzz Aldrin. So, command module. Remember this thing where once they were separating the two spacecraft, Apollo 11 was no longer specific enough for a call sign, so they gave the two spacecraft, the command module and the lunar module, separate call signs, and that was command module Columbia, and of course famously the lunar module was Eagle, and while it was on the moon, the Eagle was called Tranquility Base. And you look at the mission patch here, that shows there the Eagle landing on the moon with the Earth behind there, and that's the three astronauts, Armstrong, Michael Collins and Buzz Aldrin. So liftoff was 1332, translunar injection burn. Remember that Apollo 8 was the first mission to do a translunar injection burn. That's the one where you leave Earth orbit and head off towards the moon. 2 hours and 33 minutes into the mission, so as quickly as possible there. And it takes then another 72, it takes 3 days and an hour, to get to the moon and go into that elliptical orbit around the moon there, which they then circularized a few hours later. And we're into a 2-hourly orbit around the moon. This was the configuration when they got there. Command and service module here, the capsule there, and the lunar module docked onto the front. They did a little turnaround on the way to the moon where they hooked this out of the space between the command and service module here and the third stage of the Saturn V rocket. So that's the configuration in which they went to the moon. They then undocked the command and service module from the lunar module and then fired the descent engine for 29 seconds, and that just separated the two craft. A bit later, they then started firing the descent engine to slow them right down, and of course at that point there is no air or anything on the moon and no wings on the lunar module. The only thing keeping the lunar module from falling under lunar gravity is that rocket. And it's a single point of failure, and it's quite a high risk thing to do, but they fired that until they actually landed on the ground. They landed a few minutes later, and the first thing they did was they prepared to leave again in case anything happened that required them to quickly evacuate from the lunar surface. They had that ready straight away. They were scheduled then to have some sleep, and they elected not to, because you're on the moon, what are you going to do? You want to go out for a walk, don't you? This is the bit, right, this is the configuration where they've undocked the lunar module, and this is how it goes down to the moon. It's firing that rocket all the time to keep the spacecraft slowing down nicely to land comfortably on the moon. Now then, I can get someone to talk you through the process of landing, and that's this here. This is Neil Armstrong taking you through the whole thing. He recorded this a few years ago, not long before he died.
This slide shows the trajectory to the surface. The actual powered descent of the lunar module to the surface took 12 minutes and 32 seconds. And this is just the final 3 minutes, the part that's really interesting as you get close to the surface of the moon. Now, in the left screen, you will see the original 1969 movie film that we took from the window of the lunar module Eagle. And on the right side, you will see what the crew saw looking out the window in front of them. Now, there is a shaded area there that shows you the exact duplicate of the area that's on the left, so you can compare the craters and see if they are duplicate of each other. The one on the left took place 42 years ago. This picture's on the right took place in the last 2 years. Okay, we've been descending. I should tell you, you'll hear the crewmen talking. You'll hear my co-pilot giving altitude and descent rates, and you'll hear people in the background talking from mission control on Earth. We've been descending about 2,000 meters a minute. We're now down to about below 1,000 meters in altitude.
21 down, 33 degrees.
My computer tells me that it's taking us to a landing just on the right side of that big crater up in the left-hand corner. The slopes are steep and the rocks look very large, the size of automobiles. Certainly not a place that I want to land. So I took over manually from the computer, the autopilot, and flew it like a helicopter on out to the west to try to find a smoother, more level landing spot. The computer is complaining now and then. You'll hear caution alarms, 1202s and 1201s, which is telling us the computer is a little bit concerned about its operation, but everything looks good, and the people in mission control tell us we can continue. Okay, we're about 100 meters above the surface, looking down at this 30-meter crater, about 8 meters deep. Looks like a real geological treasure. I want to go back there and look at that if I ever get the chance while I'm on foot. We're looking for a smooth spot beyond that crater. I see a smooth spot right up near the top of the screen. It looks like that's a good place to be, and I'm running low on fuel. I have less than 2 minutes of fuel.
Good. 20 feet.
Getting down below about 70 meters now.
2.5 down, 9 forward.
50 meters, still looking good.
75.
In the left side, you will see in the old movie that the rocket engine is starting to kick up some dust off the surface.
Lights on. Down 2.5.
Get a 30-second fuel warning. Need to get it down on the ground here pretty soon before we run out. Okay.
43 down, 2.5.
The picture on the left is more accurate, but there's more dust. There you see the shadow of my landing leg coming on the surface on the blowing dust.
Good into the right level.
We're very close to the surface right now.
Hey. Contact light. Okay, engine stop. We copy you down, Eagle.
So there you go, they're on the moon. Excuse me. So they've landed in the Sea of Tranquility, 2017 Universal Time on the 20th of July. And the next thing they do, they get ready and then they go out for an extravehicular activity on the moon. Just a little note I put here, by the way, in an interview some years ago, Neil Armstrong did divulge that amongst his ancestors were cattle rustlers from County Fermanagh. So there's a local angle on that. Everyone in America has to have an Irish connection. It's compulsory. So there we are. They're on the moon, and Armstrong came out of the lunar module and released the television camera. So that's how we saw him come down the steps. And the first thing he does once he got down is gets an emergency rock sample, so they've got something to take home should they need to leave at short notice. 19 minutes later, Buzz Aldrin follows him out onto the lunar surface. So here we are. Here's the footage of that.
Okay, Neil, we can see you coming down the ladder now. I'm at the foot of the ladder. The limb footbeds are only impressed in the surface about 1 or 2 inches. I'm going to step off the limb now. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Yeah, sorry, it's a little bit loud, that one, and the one before was a little bit quiet, but that's how video goes. So there they are, they're on the moon, and although Apollo 11 was the first landing and the one in which they spent the least amount of time on the moon, they did actually manage to do some serious science while they were there. They deployed quite a number of experiments. There's one, the solar wind composition experiment. Of course, the moon having no air and whatever is an ideal place to actually analyze solar wind, and so they put an experiment for that. They collected a considerable sample of lunar material, And actually, one of my favourite things there is that, of course, the lunar rock was fabulously valuable in that there could only be a limited amount of it. And to give you an idea of how valuable they considered that to be, once they'd actually finished taking all their photographs and taken the film off the cameras, they left Hasselblad cameras on the moon so they could take more rock home. So if you want a free Hasselblad, I know where there's a few. So that's part of the experiments. Then they did other things. A laser ranging retroreflector. Those are still there. There's 6 of them on the moon. And it's possible using those by shining a laser from the Earth and looking at the reflection to very, very accurately measure the distance to the moon. And over the period of 50 years that they've been there, 50 years in July, we have actually ascertained that the moon is moving away from us just by a few centimetres in that time. And one of the things that does mean is that in thousands of years' time there will be no more total solar eclipses because the moon won't be close enough to completely cover the sun's disk. So that's what we get from that. Seismic experiment package, so looking for earthquake activity on the moon. And a collection of 2 core tube samples of the lunar surface. So they drilled down a little bit into the soil to get some rock samples that are not directly on the surface. After 2 hours and 15 minutes on the lunar surface, they returned to the lunar module, slept for a while, and then lifted off from the moon to dock with the command and service module, and then returned to the Earth, taking another 3 days to get home and splashing down in the Pacific. I've got a little bit of footage of that and the celebrations thereafter. Here we go, this is them coming home.
Apollo 11 Houston with a little recovery force information, over. Go ahead. Roger, the Hornet is on station, just far enough off the target point to keep from getting hit. Recovery 1, the choppers...
July 24th, the Hornet was on station.
Hornet reports a sonic boom a short time ago.
Apollo 11 Houston, in the blind, Air Boss has a visual contact. Apollo 11 Houston through Araya, standing by. Over. Strokes. Apollo 11, this is Hornet, over. Apollo 11, this is Apollo 11, reading your live course. Our position 1330, 6915. 11 Hornet, copy, 1330-1675. Any further data, over? 330-169er-15.
Indeed. So there you are. That was the challenge. I believe this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth. And there, 8 years and 2 months later, they did exactly that with Apollo 11. So there we are. That's them on the moon. So thank you very much. That's Apollo 11.